The idea that the US economy is addicted to crisis sounds extreme at first, almost conspiratorial. But when you slow down and really look at the pattern, it becomes harder to ignore. For decades, the American economic system has moved from one emergency to the next, and instead of treating these moments as warnings or failures, it has increasingly learned how to absorb them, monetize them, and even depend on them. Crises are no longer interruptions to the system, they are part of how it functions. Recessions, financial collapses, debt ceilings, banking failures, housing crashes, pandemics, and geopolitical shocks all seem different on the surface. But beneath them runs a familiar cycle: panic, intervention, consolidation of power, and then a temporary sense of stability that quietly plants the seeds for the next breakdown. This raises an uncomfortable question. What if the system isn't broken in the way we think it is? What if it's working exactly as designed, feeding on instability rather than eliminating it? In a healthy economy, crises are meant to be rare, painful lessons that force structural change. In the US economy, they have become recurring events, anticipated, modeled, and in some cases, quietly welcomed by those who know how to navigate them. Every major crisis triggers massive government intervention, whether through bailouts, stimulus packages, emergency lending programs, or regulatory exceptions. These actions are always framed as temporary, as necessary measures to save the economy, protect jobs, and prevent total collapse. And in the moment, they often do prevent worse outcomes, but they also reinforce a deeper dependency, a system that relies on extraordinary measures to sustain normal operations. Over time, what was once unthinkable becomes routine. Trillions of dollars appear almost overnight. Interest rates are slashed to near zero, balance sheets explode, and markets, instead of fearing crises, begin to expect rescue. This expectation changes behavior long before the next crisis arrives. Companies take bigger risks. Financial institutions grow more complex and interconnected. Investors chase higher returns with the confidence that someone, somewhere, will step in if things go wrong. Risk doesn't disappear, it just gets redistributed, often upward, away from those with power and toward those without it. When the crisis finally hits, it doesn't reset the system, it concentrates it. Smaller players fail, larger ones absorb the damage or are absorbed themselves. Inequality widens, not because crises are unavoidable, but because the response to them follows a predictable hierarchy. This pattern didn't emerge overnight. It has been building for generations, shaped by policy choices, political incentives, and cultural narratives about growth, success, and American exceptionalism. The US economy has long been celebrated for its resilience, its ability to bounce back stronger after every shock. But resilience can become a double-edged sword. When recovery is prioritized over reform, when speed matters more than reflection, the underlying causes of instability are left intact. The system learns that it can survive without changing, as long as the next intervention is big enough. Over time, crisis becomes less of a failure state and more of a mechanism, a way to justify actions that would otherwise face resistance. Emergency powers expand, oversight weakens, wealth shifts quietly but decisively. And once the dust settles, the narrative focuses on survival, not on accountability. People are told to be grateful that things didn't get worse, even if their own lives are now more precarious than before. Wages stagnate, costs rise, job security erodes. Yet markets recover, headlines celebrate record highs, and the gap between economic performance and lived reality grows wider. This disconnect fuels confusion and frustration. Many people sense that something is wrong, that the economy is always on the brink, always one shock away from disaster, but they're also told that this is normal, that volatility is the price of progress. The result is a strange form of normalization, where crisis fatigue sets in. Another collapse becomes just another news cycle. Another bailout becomes just another headline. And slowly, the idea of a stable, predictable economic future begins to feel unrealistic, even naive. This is how addiction works, not through constant chaos, but through repetition and adaptation. The system doesn't collapse under crisis, it metabolizes it. It adjusts, grows more dependent, and prepares for the next hit. And unless something fundamentally changes, the question is no longer whether another crisis is coming, but how soon and who will pay the price when it does. Before we go further, take a moment to sit with that idea, because in the next part, we're going to look at how this addiction formed in the first place, and why breaking it may be far more difficult than anyone wants to admit. To understand how the US economy developed this dependency on crisis, you have to step back and look at the long arc of its evolution, not just individual moments of collapse. Early on, crises were treated as existential threats, events that demanded deep structural responses. The Great Depression, for example, reshaped institutions, regulations, and the relationship between the government and the economy for decades. Pain led to reform, and reform created stability, at least for a time. But as the economy grew larger, more complex, and more global, the political and financial incentives began to change. Short-term growth became more valuable than long-term resilience. Financial innovation outpaced regulation. Debt became not just a tool, but a foundation. And gradually, the system learned that it could delay consequences instead of confronting them. Every time a looming problem was pushed into the future, it reinforced the idea that collapse could always be postponed. This is where the addiction truly begins, not with the crisis itself, but with the belief that consequences are optional. In the late 20th century, especially after the deregulation waves of the 1980s and 1990s, the economy became increasingly financialized. Profits were no longer driven primarily by producing goods or services, but by managing assets, leveraging debt, and speculating on future value. This shift made the system faster, more profitable, and more fragile. When finance dominates, small disruptions can ripple outward with enormous force. Instead of reducing this fragility, policymakers often chose to manage it. They treated instability as a technical problem, something that could be smoothed over with liquidity injections, rate adjustments, and emergency backstops. And for a while it worked. Each intervention reinforced confidence that the system was under control. But it also taught markets a dangerous lesson. Volatility wasn't a signal to slow down, it was an opportunity. If risk could be socialized while rewards remained private, then taking on more risk became rational. This dynamic reached a breaking point during the global financial crisis, a moment that exposed how deeply embedded this logic had become. The response was swift and massive, and it prevented total collapse, but it also cemented a new precedent. Institutions deemed too big to fail were saved, not because they had acted responsibly, but because their failure would have been catastrophic. This decision sent a message that still echoes today. Size and interconnectedness were no longer just competitive advantages, they were shields. The larger and more central an institution became, the more indispensable it was, and the more likely it would be protected in a crisis. Over time, this created a self-reinforcing loop. Power concentrated, complexity increased, transparency declined. Meanwhile, the narrative told to the public focused on recovery and growth, not on the deeper transformation taking place beneath the surface. People were encouraged to believe that the crisis was an anomaly, a once-in-a-generation event, even as the structural conditions that caused it remained largely intact. In the years that followed, instead of reducing leverage or simplifying the system, new forms of risk emerged. Corporate debt surged, asset prices inflated, inequality widened. And once again, the system relied on the assumption that intervention would always be available. When the next shock arrived, it didn't feel surprising, it felt inevitable. What changed wasn't just policy, but psychology. Crisis became embedded in expectations. Investors, corporations, and even governments began to plan around it. Emergency tools were no longer extraordinary. They were part of the standard playbook. This normalization has profound consequences. When a system expects crisis, it stops trying to prevent it. Prevention is slow, politically difficult, and often invisible. Response, on the other hand, is dramatic, immediate, and rewarding for those who control it. Politicians gain authority. Financial actors gain opportunity. Entire industries form around managing disruption rather than eliminating its causes. And ordinary people are left navigating a world where stability feels temporary and fragile. This is the quiet cost of an economy addicted to crisis. It doesn't just produce financial instability, it reshapes behavior, incentives, and expectations at every level. People save less because the future feels uncertain, workers feel disposable, communities feel exposed, and yet the system continues to present itself as successful, pointing to growth charts and market indices as proof of health. But growth without security is not stability, it's volatility disguised as progress. As we move into the next part, we'll explore how this addiction affects everyday life, how it shapes work, debt, and opportunity, and why so many people feel like they're constantly running just to stay in place. When an economy becomes dependent on crisis, the effects don't stay confined to financial markets or policy debates. They spill directly into everyday life in subtle but powerful ways. For most people, this addiction doesn't show up as a dramatic collapse. It shows up as a constant background pressure, a sense that stability is always conditional. Jobs feel temporary, even when they're labeled permanent. Benefits shrink or disappear. Long-term planning becomes harder, not because people lack discipline or ambition, but because the rules keep changing. In a system shaped by recurring shocks, flexibility is praised, but it's often a euphemism for vulnerability. Workers are expected to adapt endlessly, retrain constantly, and absorb uncertainty as a personal responsibility, while the structures above them remain largely insulated from the consequences of failure. Debt becomes the bridge between stagnant wages and rising costs. Households take on loans not to get ahead, but to stay afloat. Credit cards cover emergencies. Student loans delay adulthood. Mortgages stretch further into the future. This isn't accidental. In a crisis-prone economy, debt functions as a stabilizer, not for people, but for the system itself. It keeps consumption going even when income falls behind. It shifts risk from institutions to individuals. And when another crisis hits, that debt becomes a lever, a way to discipline behavior and justify harsh adjustments. People are told to tighten their belts, to be responsible, even as the forces that created their precarity remain untouched. This dynamic creates a deep psychological toll. Living in a system that lurches from emergency to emergency changes how people see the future. Optimism becomes cautious. Trust erodes. Institutions feel distant and unreliable. And when bailouts are fast, but relief is slow, when markets recover but communities don't, it sends a clear signal about priorities. Over time, this breeds cynicism, disengagement, and anger. Some people withdraw, convinced the game is rigged. Others double down, taking greater personal risks in hopes of breaking through an increasingly narrow path to security. Both responses are rational reactions to an unstable environment, but neither addresses the root problem. The economy keeps moving, but the sense of shared progress fades. Another consequence of crisis addiction is how it distorts opportunity. In theory, volatility creates chances for innovation and growth. In practice, those opportunities are unevenly distributed. People and institutions with access to capital, information, and political influence can position themselves to benefit from disruption. They buy assets at distressed prices, they consolidate competitors, they shape the rules of recovery. For everyone else, crisis means loss, not opportunity. This imbalance reinforces inequality, not just in wealth, but in agency. Some people can plan around crises, others can only react to them. This gap widens with every cycle. What's especially striking is how normalized this has become. Younger generations in particular have grown up knowing little else. Financial crises, pandemics, climate disasters, and geopolitical instability are part of the landscape, not exceptions. The idea of a stable career path, affordable housing, or predictable retirement feels increasingly out of reach. And when instability is all you've known, it stops feeling like a problem to be solved and starts feeling like a fact of life. This is perhaps the most dangerous effect of all. An economy addicted to crisis doesn't just produce material insecurity, it reshapes imagination. It limits what people believe is possible. It narrows expectations and lowers demands. Instead of asking why the system keeps failing, people are encouraged to ask how they can personally survive it. Responsibility is individualized, while structural causes fade into the background. As long as people are busy adapting, there's less pressure to change the underlying rules. In the next part, we'll examine who benefits most from this cycle, how power consolidates through repeated crises, and why meaningful reform becomes harder every time the system is saved. To really grasp why the U.S. economy remains trapped in this cycle, it's essential to look at who benefits most when crisis becomes routine. Crises are often described as great equalizers, moments when everyone suffers together, but the reality is far more uneven. While losses are widespread, gains are concentrated. Each major disruption reshuffles the economic landscape, and those with the resources to endure uncertainty, access capital, and influence decision-making are positioned not just to survive, but to expand their power. When asset prices fall, those with liquidity can buy what others are forced to sell. When regulations are relaxed in the name of emergency, those already dominant can move faster than smaller competitors. And when recovery begins, it often begins at the top, long before it reaches the rest of society. This is how crisis quietly accelerates consolidation. Industries shrink in number but grow in size. Markets become more centralized. Competition weakens. Over time, this concentration of power feeds back into policy. Large institutions gain leverage not only through economic importance, but through political influence. Their failure becomes unthinkable, which means their preferences carry more weight. This creates a feedback loop where the same actors who benefit most from crisis also help shape the responses to it. Reform becomes selective. Accountability becomes symbolic. Structural change is deferred in favor of stability, even when that stability is fragile and temporary. The language of necessity does much of the work here. In a crisis, there is no time for debate, no space for radical alternatives. Decisions must be made quickly, experts must be trusted, and dissent is often framed as irresponsible. This atmosphere narrows the range of acceptable solutions. Policies that might face resistance under normal conditions become possible, while deeper reforms that would challenge entrenched interests are labeled unrealistic or dangerous. Emergency becomes an argument in itself, and once that logic takes hold, it's difficult to reverse. Even when the immediate threat passes, the structures and precedents remain. Temporary measures linger. Exceptional powers become normalized. The next crisis then arrives in a system already shaped by the last one. This cumulative effect makes meaningful reform harder with each cycle, not because solutions don't exist, but because the cost of change grows. Any attempt to reduce dependency on crisis threatens powerful interests and destabilizes arrangements that have become deeply embedded. The system appears strong, but it's strong in a very specific way. It's resilient to shocks, but resistant to transformation. It can absorb enormous stress without collapsing, but it struggles to evolve towards something more stable and equitable. This creates a paradox. The more the economy proves it can survive crises, the less urgency there is to prevent them. Survival is mistaken for success. Recovery is treated as vindication. And the deeper question, whether constant emergency is the price of the system itself, is pushed aside. For the public, this can feel like a constant whiplash between fear and reassurance. Each crisis is framed as unprecedented, yet the response feels strangely familiar. Promises are made, lessons are declared learned, and then, slowly, attention shifts elsewhere. Without sustained pressure, momentum for reform dissipates. Fatigue sets in. People adapt, not because they believe in the system, but because they feel they have no alternative. This is how an economy addicted to crisis maintains itself, not through force alone, but through normalization and resignation. As long as instability feels inevitable, it becomes easier to accept than to challenge. In the final part, we'll ask the hardest question of all, whether this addiction can be broken, and what it would actually take to build an economy that doesn't rely on crisis to function. The question of whether the U.S. economy can break its addiction to crisis is uncomfortable, precisely because it forces us to confront how deeply this pattern is embedded. Ending the cycle isn't just a matter of better regulation or smarter policy. It requires a shift in priorities, incentives, and expectations that cuts across politics, markets, and culture. The first challenge is that prevention doesn't look like success in the way crisis response does. Preventing a collapse rarely generates headlines, applause, or immediate political rewards. It requires long-term thinking, restraint during boom periods, and a willingness to slow down growth in favor of stability. In a system obsessed with quarterly results and election cycles, that kind of patience is hard to sustain. Yet without it, the economy remains trapped in a loop where excess builds quietly until it can only be released through disruption. Breaking the addiction would mean redefining what economic health actually looks like. Instead of measuring success primarily through market performance and GDP growth, it would require focusing on resilience at the household and community level. Stable wages, affordable housing, manageable debt, and reliable public services are not just social goals, they are economic shock absorbers. When people are less fragile, the system as a whole becomes less vulnerable. But investing in that kind of stability often challenges powerful interests, especially those that profit from volatility, leverage, and scarcity. Another barrier is the psychological comfort that crisis provides to those in control. Emergencies justify concentration of power and rapid decision-making. They simplify narratives and reduce complex problems to urgent choices. Letting go of that dynamic means accepting uncertainty without spectacle, complexity without shortcuts, and accountability without excuses. It means acknowledging that some forms of growth are unsustainable and that some profits are extracted at the cost of long-term stability. These are difficult admissions for a system built on confidence and momentum. Still, history shows that change is possible, but usually only when pressure becomes unavoidable. The risk is that the longer reform is delayed, the more severe the next crisis must be to force it. This is the darkest side of addiction. Tolerance builds. Each intervention must be larger than the last to achieve the same effect. Each rescue creates expectations that make the system even harder to unwind. At some point, the tools that once stabilized the economy lose their power and the costs become too great to ignore. The choice, then, is not between crisis and comfort, but between managed change and uncontrolled collapse. For individuals, understanding this pattern is a form of empowerment. It allows people to see that constant instability is not a personal failure, but a systemic feature. It reframes frustration as awareness and anxiety as a rational response to uncertainty. Awareness alone doesn't fix the system, but it changes the conversation. It shifts blame away from individuals and toward structures. It opens space for demands that go beyond short-term relief and toward long-term reform. Ultimately, an economy that doesn't rely on crisis would be quieter, less dramatic, and less spectacular. It would generate fewer moments of panic and fewer moments of euphoria. But it would also offer something far more valuable: predictability, dignity, and the ability to plan a future without assuming disaster is always around the corner. Whether that future is possible depends not just on policy, but on what people are willing to question, demand, and imagine. If this analysis resonated with you, keep watching the next suggested videos to deepen your understanding of how global economic systems really work. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations like this.